Ukraine suffered between 127 billion and 750 billion in damages so far. Putin doesn't plan on stopping the invasion, but it's clear that his offensive isn't working. Does he have other plans for the former Soviet Union member? The offensive began as a way to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. But this was in February of 2022. Almost a year has passed since then, and this so-called military operation shows no signs of stopping anytime soon. So we have to wonder, what if Russia never wanted to win the war in Ukraine? 1 year into the war and Russia is losing guns, ammunition, tanks, armored vehicles, strategic positions in Ukraine, and most importantly, soldiers. We don't know how many soldiers have been killed or wounded exactly. The estimates vary wildly because of the ongoing war, but the number of casualties is in the tens of thousands. However, there is a consensus that Russia has lost more soldiers than Ukraine, unless you listen to Russia. In that case, Russia is winning the war. If you take a deeper dive into this war, you'll see that Russia is using dated technology, old guns, and barely any food. In the past, we've heard how Russia was this global superpower that could bring down any enemy you placed in their way. And here, they are losing a war against an enemy relatively smaller than they are. What's going on? To us, there are two possible explanations for this. Russia's military has never been as advanced as it claimed, and they are just a poverty-stricken nation that cannot attack or conquer any nation. Scenario 2. Russia is deliberately sending troops with dated military weapons into Ukraine because their main goal is to leave the country in ruin. The third scenario is smashing that like button if you haven't done so already. But let's get back to the first two. If we look at Russian troops in Ukraine, we'll see that they are using pen and paper when creating plans of attack for Ukraine. All while the US is trying to tell us how they have hacking technology powerful enough to break inside the voting software used in the states and rig their elections. But we're not finished. They are also sending soldiers onto the battlefield with Soviet-era maps of Ukraine. They are not encoding the conversation soldiers are having with their families. The soldiers are poorly clothed. They lack armor and helmets, and the food rations they are receiving are practically non-existent. On top of that, the drafted soldiers receive no prior training to being sent to the front. Some Russian fighters said that they had to read Wikipedia articles on how to use the gun they were given. Obviously, something doesn't add up here. On one hand, they demolish cities with long-range missiles, and on the other, they are sending soldiers with paper maps and no training onto the battlefield. So the question we begin to ask is, why? According to a recent interview, Vladimir Putin said, "The dynamic is positive. Everything is developing according to the plan of the Defense Ministry and General Staff." A statement like this only complicates things even further. On the one hand, Putin could be lying and trying to cover up the fact that the Russian invaders are being decimated on the battlefield. On the other, what if he is true? Hear us out. What if this was Putin's plan all along? Clearly, Russia is capable of destroying large parts of Ukraine. They had no problem taking control of the Donetsk and the Luhansk Oblast. But why then is he sending soldiers to fight in Ukraine? Just a few months ago, Moscow mobilized another 300,000 men to fight on the battlefront. And in the meantime, Putin is saying that he does not want a war with Ukraine. Before the conflict escalated, in an interview with Olaf Scholz, the Chancellor of Germany, Vladimir Putin answered this very same question, saying, "Do we want this or not?" Of course not. That is exactly why we put forward proposals for a process of negotiations. We are ready to work further together. We are ready to go down the negotiations track, but all the questions should be, but all issues, as stated earlier, should be considered as a whole. He basically said that he doesn't want a war. The media likes to portray him as this evil Tsar of Russia that rules the country with politicians and billionaire businessmen in his back pocket. At least, that's how he's been portrayed in the media. But in Russia, his image is different. Yes, Vladimir Putin is a harsh leader. Maybe even all of those allegations about his $200 billion net worth are true. But what we have to realize is that he's not as bad as some of the other Russian leaders in the past. We have to remember that most of these Soviet-era presidents, from Stalin until the beginning of the 90s, weren't any better. If you're a Russian who has lived through the Soviet Union and you compare that life to the life of Russia today, the resemblance is startling. The poverty in the country was appalling, food was scarce, shelter tiny, and all of a sudden, Putin comes along in the 90s and now you have a completely reformed country. Of course, they're not going to view him as a bad guy. Of course, they don't consider him an evil mastermind. So why is this important? Isn't he behind the senseless war that murdered tens of thousands of soldiers and wounded hundreds of thousands more? Didn't his quote-unquote military operation take the lives of 7,068 civilians and injured 11,415 more? We understand that. But we have to look at this war from the perspective of an average Russian, not the young guys you see in most online interviews. They are just one part of Russia's population. In Russia, they are presenting Putin as a leader who has urged NATO not to make any other expansion toward Russia's borders. Putin openly stated that Russia smashed that subscribe button just like you should if you haven't done so already. But no, seriously now. He said that Russia applied to join NATO in the past, but they were coldly declined. When they pleaded with the alliance not to expand eastward, they didn't listen. They expanded 5 times since 1997, just before the conflict. Zelensky claimed that he wanted Ukraine to join NATO. This was the last straw for Russia. So in Russia, the media portrays the West as evil. In the Western world, they are portraying Putin as evil. Did this work? If it did, the war would be over. We wouldn't be talking about this anymore. But no, the war is not over. Zelensky in one interview said Putin, is a nobody. When asked whether he would negotiate peace with Russia, they even applied for an expedited NATO membership. The Western countries are sending a total of 321 tanks to Ukraine in the form of military aid, and they are further willing to supply all necessary aid for Ukraine. That might sound good coming from the West, but the Kremlin is saying that all of NATO is working against Russia and is helping Ukraine. Regardless of how you look at it, people in Russia will be influenced by this. Steps like this will cement in their minds the notion that the West is evil, and they are trying to take down their beloved Russia. Putin is currently 70 years old. He won't be here for long. What happens to Russia after he is gone in 10 years? What will Russian people think about the West, who keep imposing sanctions on their economy? Are they affecting the population? Well, when you consider what they lived through in the Soviet era, switching from Coca-Cola to a generic brand of Coke is a walk in the park. We don't know exactly what Russia's goal is with Ukraine. We know that the Western leaders aren't even trying to figure that. They are too busy vilifying Putin and his allies, all while Russia is busy doing the same for the West. It obviously doesn't work. And the sooner we figure out what Putin wants from NATO and the West, the sooner we can begin negotiations to end the war and find a solution. You might argue that negotiations don't work because they didn't work in the past. But we're going to say that most of the negotiations in the beginning were centered around pressuring Putin to accept peace or suffer the consequences of the sanctions. Do you think this is a good way to negotiate? Check out these videos next.